The wind that moves through the Albanian highlands carries no passport. It is ancient, unclaimed by empire or border, whispering stories not found in books but etched into bone, stories that modern science is only now beginning to read. In the hills of what is now Croatia, just across the Adriatic, archaeologists unearthed the remains of a man buried nearly 3,600 years ago. He died sometime between 1630 and 1500 BCE, when the Bronze Age was still forging the early architecture of Europe's future. But this man didn't disappear into the mists of forgotten history. In a sense, he survived. His Y DNA, carrying the marker J2b2a-L283, is alive today, not in relics or ruins, but in the blood of modern Albanians. And before we go further, if no one's ever told you this part of the story, if the history books skip this chapter, make sure you subscribe now, because we're just beginning to uncover a genetic legacy Europe forgot to remember. Here's a question for you. How many modern nations can say their DNA still sings with the same ancestral signal from the Bronze Age? Uninterrupted, unbroken? Could it be just one? While much of Europe saw its ancient bloodlines swept aside by migrations, invasions, and collapsing empires, something different happened in the Western Balkans. The people who would one day be called Albanians didn't just endure change. They resisted it. They remained rooted. More than 6,000 ancient Balkan genomes have now been analyzed, and the verdict is striking. Albanians are not a population layered over others. They are not a recent patchwork of Slavic, Ottoman, or Greco-Roman genes. They are a direct continuation of the Bronze and Iron Age peoples of this region, peoples once called Illyrians. We're not talking metaphors or myths here. We're talking direct genetic evidence. Haplogroups like J2b2a-L283 and R1b, Z2103, found in Bronze Age Balkan remains, are present today in significant numbers among Albanian men, especially in the mountainous north. These lineages form a kind of living bridge between the past and the present. J2b2a-L283, for instance, is rare across most of Europe, except in Albanians, where it hovers around 14 to 17%. It was found in a man buried in Veliki Vanik around 1600 BCE, and today, it pulses in living veins across Kosovo, northern Albania, and North Macedonia. This is not mere genetic drift. This is cultural and biological continuity, the survival of a people's identity at the molecular level. And it's not just one marker. R1b, Z2103, linked to the steppe migrations and the Amnea culture, is also a Bronze Age presence in the Western Balkans, now embedded within the Albanian genetic landscape. Unlike the R1a found more commonly in Slavic groups, Z2103 connects Albanians to a specific Indo-European thread. Not Northern, not Central European, but Balkan. That distinction matters, because when we ask why Albanian DNA is so unique, the answer doesn't begin in modern politics or recent wars. It begins thousands of years ago, beneath the soil, in the bones of people who never left, people whose descendants still walk those mountains. So here's something to consider. If your DNA could speak, what stories would it tell? Could it recall a time before Rome, before Greece, before maps even existed? For Albanians, the answer may already be written. In blood, in stone, in bone. Somewhere between the peaks of the Dinaric Alps and the coastlines of the Adriatic Sea, a question has been quietly preserved for thousands of years. How do you stay the same in a world built on change? In the heart of the Balkans lies a land carved by rivers, defended by stone, and shaped not by empires, but by altitude. Albania isn't just a country with mountains. It is a country of mountains. And those mountains have done something extraordinary. They have preserved a genome. When you look at a map of historical Europe, Albania sits directly in the storm's path, between Rome and Byzantium, between Slavic expansions and Ottoman dominion. And yet, when geneticists trace the DNA of the modern Albanian people, what they find is stability, continuity where there should be chaos. How is that possible? Here's something that might surprise you. Albania is one of the most mountainous countries in Europe. Nearly 70% of its land is rugged terrain, steep, forested, and often impassable. That terrain didn't just shape villages and dialects. It shaped bloodlines. While neighboring populations were swept up in massive demographic shifts, the Slavic migrations of the 6th century, the Roman colonization waves, the Turkish influx from the east. Much of Albania stayed insulated, not by military resistance, but by geography itself. So let's ask something radical. Can a mountain hold back a migration? Yes, and in Albania, it did for centuries. Entire clans remained isolated in valleys and highlands, forming micropopulations that rarely mixed outside their region. These weren't just villages. They were genetic time capsules. Modern DNA analyses confirm this. Albanians form a tight genetic cluster that shows far less variation than expected in a land surrounded by diverse empires. This is unusual. In fact, principal component analyses, PCA, often show Albanians clustering away from their Slavic neighbors and instead drawing closer to southern Balkan populations, especially Greeks and ancient Balkan genomes. Even diaspora groups like the Arborish of southern Italy, who migrated during the Ottoman conquest, still carry this same unique genetic signal. They left the mountains, but the mountains never left them. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Because isolation doesn't only preserve genetics, it warps and intensifies them. In some northern highland regions, Y DNA haplogroups like E-V13 reach unusually high frequencies, especially among the Geg population. Not just because of ancient ancestry, but because small founder populations grew large within closed systems. This is the power of geographic bottlenecking. It's the same reason we see unique mtDNA subclades like H12, nearly absent in neighboring groups, but strikingly elevated in Albanians. These aren't just remnants. They're amplifications, echoes made louder by time and terrain. Think of this. In a world where cities were crossroads and coasts were sieves, the mountains of Albania became vaults. Vaults for language, vaults for law, and yes, vaults for DNA. So ask yourself, if your ancestors had to choose between survival and movement, what would they protect? Their names, their land, or their blood? Albanian clans protected all three, through centuries of isolation enforced not by policy, but by landscape, through the canon, a traditional code that governed everything from vengeance to marriage. A code that wasn't just cultural, it was genetic. Because when marriages are arranged within clans and movement is limited by mountains, the result isn't just tradition, it's preservation. And that's what we see in Albanian DNA today. A living record of what happens when a population refuses to be erased, not by sword, but by silence. But this raises an even deeper question. If a population is hidden for long enough, does it become invisible or invincible? What if I told you there's a living thread, passed from father to son, for over 3,000 years, untouched by empire, unaffected by conquest? Would you believe it? Because that thread runs through Albania, not in ancient scrolls or stone tablets, but in something far more intimate, the Y chromosome, the genetic signature of a people's paternal story. And in the case of Albanians, that story doesn't just survive, it defies expectation. Let's break it wide open. Across most of Europe, major invasions and migrations left heavy fingerprints in the male line. The Celts stamped their mark in Western Europe, the Germanics in the north, the Slavs across the Balkans. But in Albania, the picture is startlingly different. The most dominant paternal marker is E-V13, not Roman, not Slavic, not Greek. It's Balkan, deeply, primitively Balkan. It likely expanded during the Bronze Age, and today, it pulses through roughly 1 in 3 Albanian men. In Kosovo, even higher. That's not a shadow of a past. That's a continuation. And it raises the question, how did this lineage not only survive, but thrive, when all around it were swept into the churn of history? The answer may lie in what didn't happen. Unlike the waves of our 1am417, carried by Slavic migrations, or the I2a-M423, found in many southern Slavs, E-V13 wasn't replaced. In fact, it stood its ground. Slavic Y lineages, even today, remain limited in Albanians, often just 5 to 10% of the total. That's astonishing when you realize the scale of migration and assimilation seen elsewhere in the region. But it's not just E-V13. Another piece of the puzzle, J2b2a-L283, tells an equally ancient story. This marker appears in Bronze Age graves and is now found disproportionately among Albanians. In some analyses, it's described as hovering around 15%, But when you map its distribution across Europe, a pattern emerges. The higher you climb into the Albanian highlands, the stronger its presence. Almost as if the mountains guarded it. But let's push even deeper. There's a third lineage we can't ignore. R1b-Z2103, a relic of steppe pastoralists, the Amnea culture. This isn't the same R1b common in Western Europe. It's an Eastern variant, a Balkan flavor. And yes, it too lives in Albanian DNA, linking the present to a past when Indo-European tongues were just beginning to rise. So let's recap. 3 major paternal lineages. E-V13, ancient Balkan, possibly linked to the Mycenaean world. J2b2a-L283, found in Illyrian-linked remains, rare elsewhere, common in Albanians. R1b-Z2103, steppe-derived, but Balkan-rooted. These aren't just scattered traces. They're dominant. Together, they form the core of Albanian male ancestry, accounting for the vast majority of Y-DNA profiles in the population. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. When you analyze these lineages across Albania's geography, subtle regional patterns emerge. Northern Albanians, the Gegs, tend to have higher E-V13. Southern Albanians, the Tosks, show slightly elevated levels of I2a, though still lower than Slavic neighbors. These shifts hint at internal histories, tribal isolation, micromigrations, and ancient settlement patterns that stretch back millennia. And yet, despite those differences, Albanians as a whole remain one of the most genetically homogeneous populations in the Balkans when it comes to the paternal line. Think about that. In a region that's been redrawn 100 times, whose borders have shifted like sand, one people's male lineage has remained consistently anchored to the same genetic story. How is that possible? Is it the terrain, the traditions, the tribal codes that govern marriage and movement for centuries? Or is it something even older, a kind of ancestral inertia, where blood remembers what history tries to erase? Whatever the cause, the result is undeniable. Albanian Y-DNA is not just a scientific curiosity, it's a biological time machine, one that connects a modern people to a prehistoric world without interruption. So here's what I want to ask you. If your father's line could be traced back 3,000 years, what would it reveal? Would it show the scars of empire, or the quiet power of survival? In Albania, the answer is already written, and the line is unbroken. What happens when history crashes through your front door, but leaves barely a trace in your blood? In the Balkans, that question defines the genetic story of a nation that stood at the crossroads of empire for over 1,000 years, and yet remained itself. Albania wasn't spared the invasions. It was surrounded. Slavic migrations thundered in from the north during the 6th and 7th centuries. The Ottoman Empire swept in from the east centuries later. Armies marched, borders vanished, and languages shifted. But inside the DNA of Albanians, there's silence. How do you live under empire after empire and still keep your genetic core almost untouched? Let's start with the Slavs. Their arrival reshaped much of the Balkans. You can see it clearly in the Y-DNA of places like Serbia, Croatia, and Bulgaria, where 1A-M417 and I2A-M423 dominate the male line. These are the footprints of massive demographic change. Now look at Albanians. Those same markers? Present, yes, but faint, distant, sometimes as low as 5 to 10%. In some subgroups, even lower. It's like watching a storm sweep across the region and finding a dry patch, untouched in the middle. Why? Part of the answer lies in how Albanians lived, especially in the medieval and post-medieval eras. Unlike many neighboring societies that urbanized under Roman or Slavic influence, Albanians often stayed in isolated tribal units, high in the mountains or deep in rural valleys. These weren't just settlements. They were bastions of bloodlines. Intermarriage was tightly controlled. The canon, the traditional Albanian code, strictly governed kinship, marriage, and clan boundaries. In many areas, marrying outside the tribe wasn't just frowned upon, it was forbidden. And for centuries, that rule was obeyed. Imagine hundreds of micro-communities, each reinforcing its own bloodline, generation after generation. Now imagine that system persisting through the Ottoman conquest. Because yes, the Ottomans came. They ruled for nearly 500 years. But unlike in other territories where conversion and intermarriage diluted local identities, something unusual happened in Albania. The people didn't vanish. The DNA didn't blend. Autosomal studies show only trace Middle Eastern input in modern Albanians, usually tied to haplogroup J1, which appears in small amounts. Some samples show it as high as 14% in select areas, but nationwide, it's subtle. Not enough to suggest a mass demographic replacement, more like a historical fingerprint left on the surface, not deep within. And here's where it gets personal. Because in genetic modeling, the story of a people isn't told by one haplogroup or one historical event. It's the proportions that matter. And for Albanians, those proportions are astonishing. Over 85% of their genome can be traced back to pre-Slavic, pre-Ottoman populations, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Roman-era Western Balkans. That's not just retention. That's resistance. Resistance without revolt. Survival through structure, not war. Even more fascinating is the sex-biased nature of the minimal admixture that did occur. Most of the Slavic genetic influence seen in Albanians today appears in autosomal DNA, not in Y chromosome data. What does that tell us? That the Slavic gene flow came primarily through female lines, likely through intermarriage during medieval interactions, while Albanian paternal lines remain dominant. That's a rare pattern in European history. Ask yourself, what kind of society does it take to absorb the presence of foreign empires and still protect its male lineage like sacred ground? The answer lies in centuries of self-contained communities, fortified not with walls, but with memory. Families knew their roots. Tribes preserved them. And across a landscape of ever-changing rulers, the people remembered who they were, not just in stories, but in their chromosomes. Now pause. Think about your own ancestry. What parts of your identity could survive 5 centuries of foreign rule? Could your name survive? Your language? Your family line? In Albania, the answer was yes. Not because they shut out the world, but because they absorbed only what didn't change who they were. And in their DNA, you can still read the proof. Every nation tells its story through fathers, the bloodline, the surname, the legacy. But if you want to hear the voice that whispers from behind the veil of history, you listen to the mothers. And in Albania, the mothers are telling a story no one expected. While Y-DNA often gets the spotlight, passed down from father to son, mitochondrial DNA, mDNA, moves silently through the maternal line. It's the inheritance you receive from your mother, and she from hers, going back thousands of years. It doesn't shout. It survives. So what do Albanian mothers pass on? Let's start with what's expected. Like much of Europe, the most common maternal haplogroup in Albanians is H, especially its subclades. No surprise there. H dominates Europe. But here's where things get strange. One subclade, H12, shows up in Albania with a frequency that defies regional patterns. In some studies, it reaches 8% of Albanian women. In nearby populations, almost non-existent. Why? What happened in this mountainous strip of land that allowed a rare maternal lineage to take root and grow? The answer may lie in isolation. Not just geographic, but genetic isolation driven by social custom. Albanian tribes, particularly in the highlands, weren't just protective of land or honor. They were protective of bloodlines. Marriages weren't random. They were local, controlled, often arranged within the same kin groups for generations. Over time, this kind of structure creates founder effects. A single maternal ancestor, by chance or survival, leaves more descendants than others. Her mitochondrial DNA spreads through the population like ripples in still water. So picture it. A woman, possibly from the Iron Age or even earlier, carrying the rare H12 lineage. She survives famine. She avoids war. Her daughters do the same. And over centuries, that quiet genetic signal becomes amplified in Albania, while disappearing almost everywhere else. But H12 isn't the only thread. Other maternal haplogroups paint a picture of remarkable continuity. U, linked to ancient European hunter-gatherers. J, carried by Neolithic farming women who once crossed into the Balkans. W, T, K, and X, all present, each echoing different chapters of Europe's prehistory. Yet in Albania, these lineages don't scatter randomly. They cluster, They reflect something unique, a maternal genetic structure that hasn't been broken apart by waves of conquest or mass migration. Instead, it's been sealed inside generations of endogamy, layered like geological strata in family trees. Now ask yourself something. When you hear about migration, empire, and movement, you imagine men riding into new lands. But what about the women who stayed behind? The mothers who raised families in mountain valleys, who passed down songs, stories, and silent DNA? Science can't record their words, but it can read their code. And that code says this: Albanian women, through time, were remarkably consistent in their genetic signature. They didn't mix widely. They weren't replaced. Their line endured. Even in diaspora, this endurance holds. Studies of arborish populations, Albanians who settled in Italy during the Ottoman period, show mitochondrial profiles that still match mainland Albanians. Hundreds of years and hundreds of miles later, the maternal signal didn't fade. And this brings us back to H12. What does it mean for a maternal lineage to survive like that? Is it just statistical luck? Or is there something deeper? A cultural pattern that protected the maternal line, even when history tried to erase everything else? Maybe the answer lies in the rhythm of Albanian life, in songs sung by grandmothers, in food prepared the same way for generations, in stories told by firelight, passed down from mother to daughter. Because while kings and warlords rewrote the borders, it was the women who remembered. And in their DNA, we find a map that was never redrawn. So next time you think of ancient ancestry, don't just ask who your forefathers were. Ask, who were your foremothers? In Albania, they're still here. In every heartbeat, every breath, every strand of mitochondrial code. Languages are like rivers. They twist, branch, merge, and sometimes vanish. But what happens when one river doesn't connect to any other and flows alone? That's exactly what we find with the Albanian language. It doesn't sound Slavic. It's not Greek. It's definitely not Latin. And yet it somehow carries the DNA of all three, without belonging to any. So how did a language like this survive in one of the most linguistically volatile regions in Europe? Let's go back. Today, Albanian is officially recognized as its own branch within the Indo-European family. Not a sub-branch, not a cousin, a standalone survivor, a fossilized echo of something ancient, possibly older than Latin itself. Here's the twist. It didn't show up in written records until the 11th century AD. So what was happening in the 2,000 years before that? Was the language hiding? Or was it the people who spoke it, tucked away in valleys and highlands, away from the centers of imperial power? It's not just a missing chapter. It's an entire invisible library. Some linguists believe the roots of Albanian stretch back to the Paleo-Balkan languages, tongues spoken by tribes like the Illyrians, the Thracians, maybe even the Dardanians. These languages disappeared almost everywhere else. But in Albania, one thread remained. It bent, it absorbed, it evolved, but it never broke. And what's most astonishing is how the language absorbed contact without collapsing. Take Latin. After the Roman conquest of the Western Balkans, Latin began seeping into everyday speech. But instead of replacing the native tongue, it merely left an imprint, a layer. Words were borrowed, but structure stayed intact. The same happened with Greek, with Slavic, even with Turkish during Ottoman rule. It's like the language had genetic immunity, able to take in foreign material without losing its core. But how does that happen? Part of the answer may lie in Albania's geography and social structure. Villages were isolated. Communities often operated with internal rules, resisting outside influence, not out of xenophobia, but out of necessity. That cultural insulation mirrored the same patterns we saw in DNA. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Recent research suggests that linguistic isolation and genetic isolation often go hand in hand. Populations that speak unique languages tend to have distinct genetic profiles, not because language shapes DNA, but because both are preserved under similar conditions: isolation, endogamy, and historical continuity. In Albania, those conditions were met. You see it in the genome. You hear it in the speech. Even today, Albanian has preserved words and grammatical features that have long vanished from the rest of Europe. Some of these features are so archaic, they offer clues to what Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor of nearly every European language, might have sounded like. And yet, Albanian evolved without a sibling. No close linguistic relative exists today. It's the last of its kind. Ask yourself, in a continent where languages are born, break, and blend within centuries, how does one survive alone for over 2 millennia? It's not just linguistic resilience. It's cultural memory. It's resistance to forgetting. Even the name Albanians use for themselves, Shqiptarët, is different from what the outside world calls them. That inward naming, that linguistic self-awareness, reveals a population that never stopped seeing itself as distinct, no matter how many outside powers try to define it. And maybe that's the key. Because when you protect your voice, your words, your grammar, your songs, you're not just guarding a language. You're guarding your identity. So next time someone tells you languages die quickly, show them Albanian. Still standing, still speaking, still strange, and entirely its own. When you zoom into the genetic map of Southern Europe, there's a curious moment where the lines blur. Albanians, Greeks, Southern Italians. At first glance, their DNA dances in the same neighborhood. But look closer, and a strange divide appears. Same region, same ancient roots. So why do Albanians still look different in the genetic mirror? Let's unpack it. Modern Albanians often cluster closely with mainland Greeks and South Italians in PCA charts, particularly the Arborish communities in Italy, who are ethnically Albanian but have lived on Italian soil since the 15th century. That's not surprising. Geography fosters genetic familiarity. The Adriatic isn't a wall. It's a bridge. But here's where it gets interesting. When researchers examined haplogroup frequencies, especially paternal lines, the differences lit up like warning flares. Albanians carry J2b2a-L283 and E-V13 at significantly higher rates than their Greek and Italian neighbors. Meanwhile, Southern Italians tend to show stronger signals of R1b, M269, and various Mediterranean-specific clades. In short, same foundation, different build. So what does that tell us? It means that while Albanians, Greeks, and Southern Italians may share deep ancient ancestry, from early European farmers, Neolithic settlers, and Bronze Age tribes, they diverged in how they absorbed the centuries that followed. Take the Arvanites, for example, Albanian-speaking groups who migrated into Greece during the late Middle Ages. Genetically, they blended more with the local Greek populations over time. Today, many Albanians who trace their ancestry to these migrations show slightly different autosomal patterns from Albanians who stayed in the mountains of the north. It's like watching two family members who took different paths. One stayed home. One crossed the sea. After 500 years, both are still cousins, but no longer identical. So what protected the Albanian core? It might be this. While Greeks and Italians saw continuous interaction with the Roman Empire, Byzantium, and maritime trade networks, Albanians, especially those in the highlands, remained relatively cut off from large-scale foreign gene flow. Their continuity isn't just ancient. It's local, grounded. This shows up in disease profiles, too. In certain parts of Albania, there's a higher prevalence of genetic mutations that are rare in the rest of the Balkans or Italy, like unique patterns in beta thalassemia or rare alleles linked to inherited disorders. That doesn't point to weakness. It points to genetic stability over a long period of time, which is rare in such a historically volatile region. So how do you explain this paradox? A people who are genetically close to their neighbors, but consistently distinct? The answer lies in scale and frequency. Albanians didn't avoid all contact, but they had less of it, and they filtered it differently. A little Latin here, a touch of Slavic there, but never enough to replace their core. And you know what's even more fascinating? In genetic testing services today, when users get ancestry results, Albanians often show mixed scores between Southern Europe and the Balkans. Sometimes they get tagged as Greek, sometimes Italian, sometimes Balkan, but none of those labels fit perfectly. It's like the system knows something's off, but can't explain why. Maybe because the system isn't trained to recognize populations that preserve themselves so completely. So here's a thought. What if being genetically close doesn't always mean being genetically alike? What if how a people carry their past matters more than who they share it with? Albanians, Greeks, and Southern Italians may have shared the same stage, but only one of them kept the script unchanged. Some stories are carved in stone, others are whispered through DNA, but a few are written in the body, in the way it breaks, in the way it survives. Albanian DNA isn't just ancient, it's unusually consistent. And when geneticists zoom in, they don't just find ancestry, they find medical signatures that raise eyebrows. Start here. Why do Albanian children have one of the highest rates of cystic fibrosis in southeastern Europe? Why does a small province like Lushnja carry a high frequency of beta thalassemia mutations, almost mirroring genetic patterns in parts of the eastern Mediterranean? Coincidence? Not likely. What we're seeing is the byproduct of isolation over time, not just culturally, but biologically. When a population remains genetically stable for centuries, even minor mutations can snowball through generations. These aren't random. They are historical footprints, disguised as medical data. Take Gaucher disease, rare across Europe, but in Albanian patients, researchers discovered unique mutations that don't match those of other continental groups. It's as if certain genetic traits evolved quietly within Albania's borders, like plants found on only one mountain. But it goes even deeper. Geneticists studying STR markers, short tandem repeats used in forensics, found Albanians have unusually high polymorphism. That means there's great variation within a relatively small, homogeneous population. It's a paradox. How can a population be both stable and diverse? The answer lies in internal complexity. Albania isn't a monolith. It's a network of tribes, clans, valleys, and dialect zones. Each preserved its own gene pool like a guarded spring. Gegs, Tosks, Labs. Each subgroup became a microcosm of genetic drift and preservation. Now let's talk about the HLA system, the genes that control how our immune system identifies threats. In Albania, specific alleles like HLA-B*27 show frequencies that don't line up with neighboring populations. These variations might have been shaped by centuries of exposure to localized diseases, or even by ancient plagues that pressured immunity in specific directions. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question. Is being genetically unique always an advantage? Because while it creates a clear identity, it can also come with vulnerability. The same isolation that preserved ancient lineages also amplified certain health risks. That's why Albania has become a focus point for researchers studying founder effects, where a small population starts with limited variation, and certain traits, good or bad, become unusually common. But in this challenge lies opportunity. Projects like RenJet and Albanian Bloodlines are now cataloging these patterns, not just to tell historical stories, but to revolutionize genomic medicine for future generations. Personalized treatments, disease risk mapping, and ancestral health tracking all depend on understanding these rare population-level genetics. And here's where it gets personal. Every one of us carries a hidden story in our genome. But in Albania, that story is louder because it hasn't been drowned out by centuries of foreign DNA. Instead, it whispers through blood disorders, immune markers, and rare mutations, a kind of biological memory passed down without words. So next time someone says, "You look Albanian," ask them, which part of the DNA are you seeing? The ancient, the isolated, the unblended, or maybe all three, converging in a body shaped by mountains, myths, and medicine. Some legacies are written in scrolls, some in crumbling ruins. But the most enduring ones? They're carried in silence, locked inside the cells of people who never left. Albania's genetic story doesn't end with haplogroups or admixture charts. It lives in the rhythms of survival, in a people whose roots didn't just sink into the land, they held it together. Let's begin with something striking. Even after centuries of foreign rule, war, migration, and famine, Albanians remain one of the most genetically cohesive populations in Europe. That's not opinion. That's data. And it points to something extraordinary. They didn't just inherit their ancestry. They defended it. But how? Part of the answer lies in structure. For generations, Albanians were organized not around modern nation-states, but around tribal systems. Gegs in the north, Tosks in the south, Labs, Cams, Murdites, each with their own microhistories, codes, and customs. These divisions weren't weaknesses. They were guardrails, cultural boundaries that, knowingly or not, also protected genetic identity. Here's a powerful example, the Arborish. These Albanian communities fled to southern Italy between the 15th and 18th centuries, during Ottoman expansion. Centuries have passed. Borders have changed. But their DNA? Still remarkably Albanian. Not Italian. Not Greek. Despite being surrounded by other cultures, they preserved their own, through language, tradition, and marriage patterns that echoed the same endogamy seen in the highlands of Albania itself. Ask yourself, what does it take for a population to maintain genetic coherence across continents and centuries? It's not just luck. It's deliberate cultural continuity, oral histories, inherited customs, and an internal compass pointing always back to origin. Even the way Albanians remember is different. Names carry lineage. Villages trace back generations. Honor isn't just a social currency. It's an ancestral ledger. The canon didn't just guide behavior. It quietly ensured that bloodlines weren't diluted by accident or haste. And that awareness, that sacred sense of identity, is rare in modern Europe. While most nations were being redefined by empire, colonialism, and industrialization, Albanians were fighting a different battle, to remember who they were before anyone tried to tell them otherwise. This is why when you zoom out and look at the Balkan Peninsula, filled with Slavic, Greek, Roman, and Turkish overlays, Albania stands out like a clear note in a chaotic symphony. It's not louder, just purer. And yet, there's a paradox here. Because Albanians are not genetically isolated in the extreme sense, they share threads with Greeks, with Southern Italians, with ancient Balkan populations. But what sets them apart isn't what they share. It's how much they preserve compared to everyone else. They are not a museum. They are a living archive, one where ancient markers still pulse in the bloodstream of modern farmers, students, builders, and poets. So where does that leave us? In a world increasingly obsessed with novelty, Albania is proof that continuity can be revolutionary. That sometimes, the most powerful story isn't change, it's resilience. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not just genetics, not just language, but a national identity carved through silence, survival, and stunning, stubborn memory. So the next time someone tells you history is written by the victors, remind them, sometimes it's encoded by those who refuse to vanish.